Thank you guys all for coming today. I would like to present Ruth Whippman. We're here today to talk about her book, America the Anxious, Why Our Search for Happiness is Driving Us Crazy and How to Find It for Real. As a quick introduction, Ruth is a British journalist and has contributed pieces to the New York Times, The Guardian, The Independent, and The Huffington Post. She previously worked for BBC, where she was releasing numerous documentaries. And in her book, she examines what's gone wrong with American happiness and why it is leading to such an anxious and ultimately unhappy society and what can be done about it. My name is Nishu Lahoti. I'm a longtime Googler. And yeah, so would you like to tell us more about yourself?
Sure, yeah, well, we moved to California about 6 years ago from the UK, and it was quite a culture shock. You know, my background is in journalism. Do you want me to tell you a bit more about what prompted me to write the book?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Okay, well, when we first got here, we came because my husband got a job working in a tech startup, and it was quite a leap into the dark for us, you know, and I had given up my job in journalism back in the UK. And every day he would kind of shut the door going off to work, and I'd have these 12 cavernous hours of time to fill before I could have an adult conversation again. You know, we had a young baby at the time. So I was sort of putting myself out there and trying to meet, you know, as many people as I could, having lots of random conversations with, you know, people in the dry cleaners and the grocery store and, you know, in the park with my son. And I found very quickly that this strange thing was happening. You know, I seem to be having the same conversation over and over again. You know, different people, different situations, different, you know, different scenarios, but the same topic just kept on coming up. And this was some variation on this theme of happiness. And people were talking about happiness almost as a real source of anxiety in their lives. You know, people were kind of asking these really big questions of themselves. You know, am I happy? Am I happy enough? Am I as happy as all my friends that I see on social media? You know, could I be happier if I was following my passion? But what is my passion? You know, all of this. And so there seemed to be this real gap between what people expected in terms of their happiness and how happy they actually were feeling. And, you know, and so I was kind of prompted, I was really fascinated, you know, it was a real cultural difference, because I think in the UK, you know, happiness is a little bit suspect, you know, you don't want to show too many overt signs of being too happy. So I wanted to look into it, and what I found was that, you know, you would think, given the kind of cultural focus on happiness here in the States and the amount of money and time and effort that people put into becoming happier, you would think Americans would be the happiest people on the planet. But statistically, you know, they actually rank very, very far down the list of happiness. So that was kind of my starting point for writing this book. I just wanted to find out why, you know, what's going wrong, and, you know, how we could, you know, how we can find out what really makes for a happy life. Yeah,
one thing you define it in the book almost like a rat race for happiness. What did you mean by that exactly?
Yeah, I mean, the expression, that sort of happiness rat race, kind of came to me when people would kind of talk about happiness almost in the same way that people talk about going on a diet. You know, there's not much pleasure involved in it, but, you know, if I just read this book and do this meditation app and you know, go to this, you know, write in my gratitude journal and be more mindful and be more positive and be more this, then I can be happy. You know, and it sort of felt like it was really a lot of hard work, happiness. You know, there wasn't much pleasure involved in it.
And something that's interesting, you have had all these experiences, you've talked to all these people who seem to be filling their life with all these measures to become happier.
Yeah.
But when you look at it statistically, the United States may be one of the least happy countries, and also our happiness levels really haven't changed in quite some time. That's correct, right?
Right. So when you look at the actual data on this, despite spending more time and money and emotional energy in trying to kind of become happier, compared to other developed nations, Americans are some of the least happy people in the Western world. And actually, there was a study that came out a year or so ago, which actually put the day-to-day contentment of people in the US at 2 places behind Rwanda. I mean, if you just think about that for a moment, you know, Rwanda is a country that has suffered a major collective psychological trauma, but yet people there are rating as more content than, you know, American office workers. So that really kind of, that was a paradox that made me want to know more and, you know, find out what was going wrong exactly.
And are there key differences that you noticed specifically from moving from the UK to the United States? Whatever that was.
I think that there are a lot of differences in the way that people talk about happiness. I think there's a real focus in the US, and I think this is a good thing in many ways, but there is a real valuing of people being positive, people being cheerful and positive all the time and appearing happy, being happy and also looking happy to everybody else, and don't be a downer and everything. And I think in the UK maybe people are a little bit more jaded, and that actually being kind of negative is almost part of the culture in a way. It's not expected that people would have such a high level of happiness all the time, and people don't go after it in quite such a relentless way, I think.
Yeah. So let's take a step back then and talk about the book for a second.
Sure.
Could you give us a brief kind of quick outline? I found it really interesting how you went about examining this rat race. Could you give us a brief outline of what you did?
Yeah, so I did lots of different things. I spent a lot of time, I sampled quite a few of the self-help offerings that people are selling. I realized self-help in this country is a multi-billion-dollar industry. A lot of money is changing hands in this, pursuit of happiness, and in this idea that we can kind of control our happiness and make ourselves happier. So I did the Landmark Forum. I don't know if any of you have heard of that, but it's a very popular self-help kind of weekend, 4-day course that's incredibly intense. And I went through everything on this spectrum of emotion while I was doing that, from sheer terror to depression to anxiety to joy to all of it. I spent time I went to Las Vegas, where I spent time in Tony Hsieh, who is the CEO of Zappos, the shoe retailer. He has a kind of happiness city almost that he's set up in downtown Las Vegas. He's bought up a whole load of land and is running it as a kind of happiness community based on principles of positive psychology and on the idea that you can maximize people's happiness. And that was a very sort of strange place to be. And I spent time with Mormons in Utah. The Mormons actually rate statistically as the happiest people in America. But actually what makes this slightly more complex is that they also have the highest rate of antidepressant use. So I was kind of trying to unpick what was going on there. And I looked at the workplace, some trends in kind of happiness engineering in the workplace. I looked at parenting, social media. And I spent some time looking at the kind of academic research on happiness, which frankly was the most joyless part of the whole endeavor. I mean, academic studies on happiness are really quite dry.
Yeah. And so in listening and reading the book, it was really interesting to see how you jumped from one topic to the next in this overall vision of what you perceive the United States to be in terms of this pursuit for happiness.
Yeah.
Which one of those experiences did you find to be the most revealing?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's hard to pick one. I mean, going to spend some time at the Downtown Project in the the Las Vegas thing that I was talking about, where this very, very wealthy tech billionaire has brought people from all over the United States to live in this community and work as entrepreneurs. And it's this kind of semi-communal living, a lot of it, where people live and work in the same place, and they've kind of maximized happiness by putting the buildings in certain places and the square, how many people per square foot, and everything is so planned. And one of the really kind of shocking things was, in this so-called happiness community, they ended up having one of the highest suicide rates in the United States. So, I mean, that was very dark and awful, tragic, but also kind of fascinating. And I think it sort of had partly to do, and a lot of the people there were saying, that it partly had to do with this extreme pressure to be happy all the time, that I think really kind of stressed people out. And that was the theme that I kept coming back to.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting topic, too, for discussion, because in the tech world, a lot of what we're discussing today is how can the Internet of Things influence your surroundings. So whether it's your home or whether it's the city itself that you live in, how can being surrounded by technology create a more fruitful life, a happier life? From your experience, was that something that was relevant to the time that you spent in downtown? Was technology ever present, and did it cause more happiness, or was it rather something else that caused people to commit suicide?
I mean, all of these things are quite complex. I mean, the Downtown Project, I mean, there was a slight sense at the beginning that they were going to use happiness, that they were going to use technology even more to kind of monitor where people went, and they had this idea that everyone was going to wear a wristband to measure, how many social interactions they had and how happy they were. And this technology actually exists. I mean, I found that they weren't actually using these wristbands in the Downtown Project, but they do use them in many companies. This has become something that your boss can kind of monitor how happy you are and how productive you are and how the two relate to each other. And there is something very big brotherish and sinister about that. I mean, I think in terms of the way that most people use technology and the internet, I mean, it's no one thing. I mean, technology is kind of what you make of it. And I think there's good and bad in that. I mean, I looked at social media as a big thing that I looked at, and I think that can bring its own anxieties. I think it sort of raises the expectations. It's the way that we use social media now, Instagram, Facebook, trying to make our lives look incredible. It's almost like a personal PR project, isn't it? Your Facebook profile and how happy you look, and here I am having so much fun in all these different situations. And I think that in itself has kind of raised the stakes for anxiety for many of us.
One of the things that I really laughed about, and I found it so relevant to my life, was two things. First and foremost, how you're right, social media becomes this PR brand.
Right.
It is your brand in its own respect.
Right.
But then you also mentioned in your book that it's also creating a sanitized version of your life to a degree.
Right.
And maybe even replacing some kind of interpersonal communication you have with other people.
Right. I mean, it's kind of become an arms race, and I think we all do it to a certain extent, and I find myself doing it, even having written a book about this. I find myself doing the same thing. Like, for instance, we went. I took my kids apple picking in a sort of local orchard recently, and frankly, the day was kind of miserable. I mean, we did, the kids were whining the whole time. It was really hot. Everybody was kind of bored. The apples were all mushy, and then the photo that ended up on Facebook of this day, the one probably millisecond in the entire day when everyone was smiling and posing and whatever, that's what ended up there. And anyone looking at that thing would have thought, Ruth, what a great day she's having, and I wish my life was like that. Meanwhile, I'm just sort of thinking, oh God, thank God that's over, And it's, the way that we kind of curate our lives now, I think it does give a very unrepresentative picture of what, happiness looks like. And I think that is adding to this anxiety of, my life really should be like this, and it's somewhere here, and, this gap.
Yeah, that's very true. One thing I wanted to touch upon was really diving into your experiences with the self-help community.
Yeah.
The Landmark Forum is kind of the pinnacle one in your book.
Yeah.
Then there's a few other ones at some elementary schools as well. And you do a really good job of just bashing on these forums and these pundits, and just like really examining in a crude way, like almost how they're swindling people. What do you think, from what you saw, attracted people to the forum, and then also to even re-up and say, like, I'll do level 2?
Right. Well, I mean, this thing, it's also, I mean, I think that naturally the type of people who are attracted to self-help tend to be in the more vulnerable end of things. I mean, you don't go on a self-help course when your life is already brilliant, so you're already dealing with people who have issues and problems. And this is a business. I mean, there is a lot of money changing hands, and it is in these people's interest to get as much money as possible, which is not to say that everybody in the self-help industry is some kind of, charlatan or fraudster or whatever that's trying to steal your money. But I think there is an element of that in this thing. And I think the Landmark Forum was a very, very intense program. I mean, you're in this room, it's a kind of conference room, and you're there for very long hours. You have very limited breaks. It's till 10 o'clock at night, and you're just getting all this information, and everybody's sharing these incredibly dark moments from their lives, and you feel very, very vulnerable, in those moments. And then they come in at just the crucial moment and say, well, maybe you'd like to sign up for the next course, and you're weeping about, your terrible childhood or whatever, and you're like, okay, whatever, I'll pay whatever it takes. And it was a very powerful emotional experience being there, and not necessarily for the good, that's for sure.
Was there ever a time, because I imagine in researching this book you wanted to get as much information as you could, was there ever a time where you're like, I don't want to go to another self-help forum, and,
Yeah.
but you force yourself to do so.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know, it's funny, when it came to the Landmark Forum, I actually did the Landmark Forum before the book. It kind of went the other way around, and that was one of the things, you know, everyone had told me, you know, do this thing, it's amazing, you've got to go. And it was sort of almost the other way around, that I did the forum thinking, just because I wanted to be happier, you know, I was kind of lonely in my new country, and I went, and that was part of what led to the book rather than the other way around. But yeah, I mean, through, you know, I did a lot of these kind of mindfulness workshops, I did meditation, I did various things, and a lot of the time I did sort of think, oh God, you know, not another one. But, you know, at the same time, I wanted to be open to these things. I didn't want to start from the position that this is all a load of rubbish and, you know, just, you know, I wanted to see what actually worked and what didn't.
And you bring up a good point too, in that the majority of people that are maybe going to a self-help forum or reading a book about self-help are in actual need of help, or rather are seeking some kind of answers. From the people that you interacted with and people that you met, do they find answers in these books? Do they experience some kind of transformation?
Well, I think a lot of people do. I mean, there's an atmosphere, kind of like a tent revival at a lot of these places, where it's like, oh yes, and everyone gets whipped up into this kind of frenzy. And then the most successful people in this industry are the people who can really prey on those emotions and kind of whip people up into a kind of a frenzy. And I think people do feel very transformed. But then one of the kind of depressing statistics is that the most likely customer of a self-help book is somebody who's bought another self-help book within the last 18 months. So there's obviously something where people get on a kind of spiral, and, you know, none of these things are actually providing quite the answers that people are hoping for. And I think, you know, you raised an interesting point when you said these are people who need help. There's something about in this whole idea, it's a very American idea in a way, this idea that our happiness is something that we can control, you know, that self-help, you know, rather than helping others, or that, you know, that help should be provided from some other source, or that you are entitled to help. It's like, you know, go out and help yourself and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make yourself happier. I don't know if you've ever seen these memes that say, you know, happiness is a choice. You know, it's quite a common phrase here. It's almost like if you don't, you know, it's your responsibility to make yourself happier. Which can be quite anxiety-inducing in itself.
And that's definitely an interesting point you bring up in the book, which is that in America it seems that we're really seeking happiness in isolation.
Yeah.
And is that starkly different from your experiences not having lived in the country?
Well, so this is one of the things that I kept coming back to in my research, which is that pretty much every piece of research that's ever been done into human happiness, and no matter how much all these studies all kind of contradict themselves in other ways, there is one factor that we know is like the single biggest cause of happiness, and that is our social connections, our relationships with other people. But yet the self-help industry and our kind of conception of happiness is moving more and more and more towards being about the self. And, you know, a lot of the activities that we're taking part in now, like meditation, like mindfulness, like yoga, like, you know, they're all about having a very private emotional experience, about looking within your soul and, you know, being internal rather than external. And I think that's one of the real problems. I think that was one of the key findings that really made me think, okay, this might be where we're going slightly wrong. Yeah. And, you know, I think it's a trend that's true in other Western countries as well. We're living increasingly isolated lives, but I think in America there's a very individualistic culture, and I think that is, you know, and our approach to happiness is, you know, me and my happiness journey and my quest for happiness and how can I make myself happier, which is probably going about it in slightly the wrong way.
And I found it really fascinating to listen to the stories that you'd bring up, specifically like around yoga and meditation, how people would be, say, doing like 4 or 5 yoga classes a week to try and get that sense of, you know, fulfillment and happiness and mindfulness. Yeah. And it kind of opened a door to maybe a different world than I would see, because I don't know many friends that are doing yoga on a day-to-day basis in order to feel content or in order to build that happiness. From what you saw, do you think that maybe, I don't know if extreme is the right word, but were they extreme examples of this seeking out of happiness?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't want to give the wrong impression that I think that yoga is the cause of all the problems in the US at the moment, because obviously that's not true. But I think it's about a kind of mindset. I think California is kind of the world headquarters of self-actualization, isn't it? So I think the things that you see here in California are maybe a little more extreme than you would see elsewhere. But these trends do hold true, you know, across the country. You know, you think about Oprah and the influence that she's had, and it's all about, you know, my personal happiness journey and, you know, my own responsibility for my happiness. And, you know, a lot of these, you know, the whole sort of yoga, mindfulness, meditation, what I've come to think of as the spiritual industrial complex. I mean, that is worth about $20 billion to the economy. I mean, it's a lot of money changing hands here. You know, it's very popular.
Yeah. So these self-help forums, these self-help books are to a degree useful, but maybe not. Maybe they don't hold all the answers for us.
Right.
From your research, what do you think could lead Americans to a happier life?
Well, I think that what I found just again and again and again, whether that was through the kind of field work or the academic stuff or whatever, is that the key to happiness really is in relationships and other people. And, you know, I say this all the time, and one of the most common responses that I get is people say, well, you know, that's fair enough, but that doesn't apply to me because I'm an introvert and I hate other people, and, you know, I'd rather just sit in my basement and, you know, never talk to anyone. But actually, all the research supports that the fact that the importance of social connection is just as true and important for introverts as it is for extroverts. It might manifest in a slightly different way. You know, it might not be going to lots of huge parties and being the centre of attention, but still, you know, the importance of having supportive relationships is just, and also it's not just for our happiness, it's for our health. Low social connection or loneliness carries with it a risk of premature death comparable to that of smoking. And it's about twice as dangerous to be lonely as it is to be obese. You know, and you think how much money and effort we put into dieting and not being obese, you know, when actually, you know, here's an answer which is so important right there.
Yeah. There was an interesting part at the end of the book talking about the genetic component of happiness and how you kind of have this like biological marker of where you're going to always be happy, and then you can have variance. Was there ever any information or studies that you found that showed maybe that fulfillment and that biological marker could be tweaked upward, not necessarily change at the baseline, but like social interactions are the things that made that marker move up? I don't even know if that's measurable, to be honest.
I mean, I think there's been various ways to measure it, and I think that people are generally agreed that there's a big genetic component to happiness. So people have a kind of happiness set point that they keep returning to, but you can kind of work around it a bit. Where the whole positive psychology movement has become slightly political, slightly ideological, is that it very much downplays the idea of circumstances on our happiness and very much plays up the idea of individual control. So there's a lot of research now, and it's kind of, a lot of it is funded by a very right-wing bias organisation. This belief that, you know, we can kind of, it's this bootstraps idea that we can make ourselves happier by trying all this stuff, and, you know, it's kind of your responsibility, and if you're not happy, it's almost like it's your own fault. And downplays all these factors like, you know, income, race, social class, you know, social projects, which actually is not a fair reading. I believe it's based on a very, very flawed reading of the data. And actually circumstances do make a huge difference.
So maybe an open-ended question is, we have all these things. We have yoga, we have meditation to build mindfulness. Religion is something that you discussed too, and that religious people are statistically more happy, but maybe in real life those statistics don't necessarily hit on the reality. With all of these things, how do they get built into a happy life while also maintaining the social connections?
Well, the religion thing that you just mentioned is really interesting, because across the world, it's pretty robust finding that religious people do rate as happier than non-religious people. And I think the temptation is to think that that is because people have this kind of private belief in God and this you know, certainty that things will be okay because there's an afterlife or whatever. But when you control for the fact that religious people have much greater number and quality of social connections, when you control for that in the studies, the difference disappears. So actually, the reason why religious people tend to rate as happier than other people is because they have such a strong sense of community, generally. And when I went to spend time with Mormons in Utah, that was a huge finding. You know, I was staying with a Mormon family, and we were sitting there for half an hour in their living room, and I think 10 different people stopped by for, you know, drop off some cookies or not a cup of tea, they don't drink tea, but that's my Britishness talking, but whatever, you know, a drink or something. And, you know, so I think it is that sense of community that really is at the heart of why religion, you know, does make people happier.
And so maybe a point for the audience, as guardians of technology at Google and arbiters of new things, what recommendations would you have to us as we build technology for people? From what you've seen in terms of happiness, one of the key things that we say at Google is like build something that someone will love to use.
Yeah.
Almost like a toothbrush experience is kind of one of the things. It's like you want to use it every single day because they love it so much. It's so useful. When we're building these things, what should we be considering?
Wow, that's a big question. If I knew that, I'd be making a lot more money than I am now. I think, you know, technology is a complicated thing because it can be a force for connection and bringing people together, and it can also be a force for isolating people as well and keeping people locked in their own smartphone and not. I mean, this is not Google, but I remember one of these moments when I was researching this book and I thought, oh my God, you know, this is the end of civilization, was when I downloaded a happiness app to my phone. And I went onto the App Store, and there's like 1,000 different options for happiness apps that you can download. And, you know, they'll send you pictures of sunsets and puppies and beaches. And there was this one that would, you know, send you pictures of your own loved ones so that you could kind of sit looking at your phone, scrolling through pictures of your loved ones, while presumably your actual loved ones are like looking at pictures of you, maybe, I don't know, on their phone. And I remember there was this one time when the one that I downloaded actually would send you these kind of positive affirmations every hour or so throughout the day, and you're supposed to repeat them. So it was, you know, I am beautiful, or I am enough, or whatever it was. And I remember, like, the problem was every time my phone buzzed when I got a message from this thing, I'd get that Pavlovian kind of jolt of, oh, someone sent me a message, great, you know, somebody wants to go out and meet for coffee, or, you know, it's a friend or whatever. And then it would say, you know, I am enough. And I think, you know, I just want to throw the phone across the thing, because the whole point is, you know, I am not enough. And I think if we are really looking to an app to make us happy, then something's gone wrong.
And to kind of hit a little bit on the research you did around social media, have you found that, at least in your research, that a lot of people have replaced those in-person connections, those interpersonal connections with your phone, with your application? Yeah,
I think there's quite good evidence to show that that has definitely happened, and especially for the kind of millennials and younger generation, I think there is a lot of concern over the fact that people are replacing real-world interactions with online ones, you know, smartphone things, for sure.
Cool. Well, I think we're going to open it up to questions in the audience, and as well as on the Dory. Allison, if he's still in the room, I think he has a mic that he can pass around.
I think someone had one over
here. Hey.
Hi.
So one of the topics that you kind of pointed out, like regarding this whole stress of trying to be happy, is like the whole like self-help community and like whatever. But like also the other thing I'm curious about is like, what about the contribution of the family? Like, because like one other thing I see, I could be wrong, but like my understanding is also like we are in this trend where like probably the kids are being like either over pampered, or like this whole notion of having any kind of negative emotion is like, oh, something is like extremely wrong, rather than just teaching them it's just part of life, and like you need to just go through it and like kind of teach them how to handle it. So how much is that also contributing in creating like generations of people who are like kind of probably extremely confused about what is right?
It's an excellent point. I actually wrote a whole chapter about parenting, and sorry if I lost my thing here. Sorry. I wrote a whole chapter in the book about parenting, and exactly what you're describing. I think there's this, you know, in the same way that there's this feeling that we can kind of force ourselves to be happy with enough hard work, there's also a kind of parallel feeling that we can kind of build this perfectly happy child, that if we just make every moment kind of magical and we take away every negative sense and every negative emotion, prioritize positivity above all else, then we will turn out these perfectly happy kids. And it's backfiring, you know, really badly. I mean, some of the examples that I came across when writing the book were actually quite ridiculous and humorous. You know, that there was this one thing that I was so shocked by when I first moved here, was that a friend of mine left her 2-year-old, I think 2.5-year-old, with another mum while she went to run some errands. And this woman, the other woman, breastfed this friend's child, this friend's 2-year-old, because she was crying. You know, it was this feeling that this child can't be distressed for one moment without, you know, somebody stepping in. I mean, that's a very extreme example, but I think there is this sort of data that we've become, or, you know, I'm a parent, and I know that I'm part of this, and it's hard to get away from it. But yeah, we have become these helicopter parents who are sort of micromanaging our kids' lives. And then the evidence is showing that kids in college now are actually suffering some really serious mental health problems, you know, so severe levels of anxiety, depression, lack of resilience, those kinds of things. And I think those trends are related for sure. Thanks.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
I took a class at Google called Search Inside Yourself about a year ago. It's I don't know if you'd call it a self-help class. It does include some meditation. But I think the biggest takeaway I had from it was a piece of advice that was, don't aim for a happy life, aim for a meaningful life.
Right.
So is that something that you found, is you should look for meaning instead of looking for happiness?
Yeah, so I think it's really, I mean, I haven't done that course, so I can't speak to exactly what was discussed there. I mean, I think meaning is obviously really important, and I think connection is the thing that's most important. I think in a way, there's this trend where meanings become the new happiness. Everyone's chasing meaning, and then it kind of loses its meaning, because what is meaning? You know, I mean, meaning is something that's different to everything else. And I think when there's this kind of MacGuffin, this thing that we're all supposed to chase after, then it becomes its own rat race. But yes, I think you're right in that it's important to see what things have value in our lives, and just for happiness to be a kind of byproduct of our lives, and living a connected, meaningful life rather than chasing after happiness specifically.
Like a question.
Hi.
Hi.
You touched upon briefly the connection between religious people being more happy because of social gatherings.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit more on that correlation? Like, what exactly causes that?
Why does social connection cause religious people?
How religious people become happy because of their social
Because of their social
gatherings.
connections, yeah. Well, I think that there's lots of research that shows that people who have a religious affiliation spend more time socialising and being part of a community. And it's not necessarily, you know, that they go on more dinner dates or whatever, but it is that, you know, if you have a religious place where you go every week, you know, if you go to church or mosque or synagogue or whatever, you know, that's very much based on community, and it's based on this kind of shared understanding that people are responsible for each other's welfare and people will look out for each other. You know, not every religious community is like that, but I think that's a kind of baseline. And so people, you know, and there's research that shows that people who are religious are more likely to do things like give blood, and who are more likely to be involved in community events, to have more social events per week than other people. And I think that's why when you control for that, when you take that out of the equation, then actually religious people aren't any happier than anybody else.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks. All right.
So, hey, thanks for coming. So you've been talking a lot about the happiness aspect, but you also mentioned the term self-actualized.
Yeah.
And I was kind of curious to hear your perspective on how you view the difference between those two, and kind of the point of around like a life of trying to find meaning. What about like an effort to try and get to better know yourself through that self-actualized term? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's about balance, because obviously getting to know who you are and, you know, becoming the best self that you can be, all of those things are important, and to work out who you are and how to work with that, that's very, very important. But I think what's happened in America is that the balance has somehow got out of whack. So we're putting self-actualization above connection. So the idea is that we kind of engineer happiness from the inside out, that if you can perfectly know yourself and understand yourself, I don't know if you've heard this phrase, happiness comes from within. It's actually impossible to get a result on a Google search that tells you the opposite, because I typed in, you know, happiness. I was going to do at one point I was thinking of doing some slides for this, and I typed in, you know, meme, happiness comes from within. You get 1,000 results of all these, you know, different memes sort of saying variations on this. If you type in meme in an image search, happiness comes from other people, every single result, seemingly, or at least on the front page, that comes back says, happiness does not come from other people. Happiness comes from within. okay. You know, and it's almost like, and so I think the balance has got wrong. So I'm not saying that people should not, you know, try to understand themselves, reflect on themselves, all of that. That's obviously important. But I think the emphasis has got wrong somewhere. You know, I think if we make connection and other people our starting point, and then throw in a bit of self-actualization rather than, you know, having the balance so skewed the other way. Thanks. Oh, hi.
You were talking about the importance of social connections. I think there are two types I can imagine. First, there are, for example, close friends who I spend a lot of time interacting with, and I have deep connection. And then there are just people I barely know.
Yes.
So it's just hard to have many close friends because it's like it takes a lot of time. But you can have a lot of people you barely know. Is there any distinction? Which type of relationships is more like? What's the difference between them, and how do they influence happiness in different ways? Close relationships and more meaningful, or just know as many people as you can?
So both are actually important, surprisingly. So it goes without saying, I think, that close friendships and really supportive relationships are more important than, you know, the woman who sells you your newspaper in the morning or whatever. But and that's, you know, really the key, is sort of focusing on a few very close supportive relationships. But there is pretty good evidence to show that having lots of there is a technical term for it, but sort of small social connections also, and being part of a wider community and feeling invested in a community also has a big impact on our happiness as well. So, you know, just feeling that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, I think. So I think in aggregate, you know, it might not be that every single one of those little connections really is that meaningful, but overall I think they can make a big difference.
And I thought that there was an interesting point in the book, not to give too many details away, but you kind of quote Thomas Jefferson in The Pursuit of Happiness. And in your interpretation, it's not so much pursuing this inward happiness, which is kind of perfected from all my self-actualization, but rather pursuing a happiness which makes you part of a community and makes you part of that larger whole.
Yes, I mean, I think that's pretty clear that the founding fathers weren't really thinking about a self-help workshop when they, you know, I mean, it's taken it to extreme, but yes, they were talking about kind of civic engagement and community, and it was very much being part of a larger thing. Cool. Virtuous. Yeah. Hi.
One more. Wonder if you haven't read your book, but if you touch on that, or what you think about, or if you've noticed. I'm not from here either, and I wonder if you've noticed that there's seems to be some bragging around mentioning or just even implying that you are busy, and people, you know, I find it very hard here to just call a friend up and say, hey, are you up for a beer? And it's virtually impossible. And where I come from, it's like, you know, we're adults, we have busy lives, but it's just easier. And I've almost become that myself too, where
everything's great and wonderful.
Right, I mean, I have 2 kids, and you know, and I work full time, and so it's also hard for me sometimes. But I get this sense too sometimes that I feel this inner pride of saying, well, you know, no, I'm busy, and tonight it's not. Can't make it work or not, and I'm like, oh I'm a busy person, and then I'm like, I feel like shit. I haven't had a beer in a long time.
Right. Yeah.
With anyone, and I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's so easy to put just socializing down to the absolute bottom of the priority list, isn't it? I mean, you know, if you have a full-time job, you work hard. I think there's this. I mean, we didn't actually talk about this, but it's something that I touched on in the book. That now, what used to be called work-life balance, they're now calling work-life integration. You know, which just makes my heart sink. It just kind of seems to mean more work, you know, that you have to have your phone on all the time, that you're answerable, you're always on the clock, and that we're kind of merging all these parts of our lives. So there's very little socializing or communicating or whatever with friends that is totally free of work and free of responsibilities in the way that perhaps it used to be. And I mean, there's this really sort of chilling statistic, which is I don't know if you've heard of the American Time Use Survey, but they just categorize how people literally spend every moment of their day, and every activity that you can think of, you know, working, sleeping, driving, having sex, whatever, is all categorized. And there's a category on the survey called socializing and communicating. And it doesn't just cover the good stuff. So it's not just, you know, the lovely heart-to-heart that you have with your best friend, or this adoring conversation with your boyfriend or girlfriend. It's like all the arguing, the nagging, the bitching, the whining, everything, all thrown in together. So as long as there's more than one adult present, and it's not an incidental part of something else. Does anyone want to hazard a guess how much time we spend on that category per day, the average American?
30 minutes.
Yeah. it's about 30 minutes a day. So put another way, we know this is the single most important sort of pillar of our happiness, but yet we spend 23 and a half hours out of every day not doing that, doing something completely different. So, I found that pretty scary. Yeah, hi.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Did you happen to see the article in the New York Times Magazine this last weekend? It was called "The Kids Who Can't," which is kind of like a mean title.
Oh, I don't think so.
It was about anxiety with millennials, and especially the youngest millennials. It was saying that, it was talking about this phenomenon. So first of all, I wondered if you came across this in your research, anxiety being a bigger problem with younger people.
Yes, definitely.
And then, hazarding guesses at how to explain it, and mentioned the social media phenomenon, which I think is right on the money, and you touched on that.
Yeah.
But another thing it talked about was how, I don't love this word, but it said that the youngest people are being coddled, in the sense that it's common now, if a kid's feeling anxious, that they're just allowed to stay home from school.
Yeah.
Or that they have their own dedicated entrance to avoid the stressors of the main entrance at school.
Yes.
And that was one of the ideas that was put forward as to why this is actually having a negative effect and keeping them in this spiral of anxiety. So I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I notice it in myself as well. I have 2 kids, and my oldest son, he goes to this kind of drama group on a Thursday, and he decided he doesn't like it and he doesn't want to go, and that he's got some anxiety around that. And instantly I click into we've got to stop, he doesn't have to go, or, why should he have to go to that? And, it's very easy to think, and I was about to pull him out of this thing, and I thought, what on earth am I doing? I mean, as if, and I sort of look back to my childhood, and probably a good 70-80% was stuff that I didn't really want to be doing that much. And, nobody was suggesting that I would not be doing it because of that. And, there's a balance and whatever. And I think it is good that we consider kids' feelings more now, and that we consider their emotions and treat them as important, and I do think that. But absolutely, I think there is this tendency and this idea that everything has to be magical and wonderful for kids, and that we remove negative experiences from their path, that is very damaging for sure.
Hi, how you doing? Thanks for coming. So my question actually kind of relation to that right there, along with the gentleman's question over here about strength of connection and also time usage. So you talk about the sense of community, obviously, and to go along with these younger generations kind of being a little more hyperactive or sucked into the social media and everything, it seems to be like a stereotype of millennials that they're ADD, they can't keep their attention for anything. So this idea of fragmentation of not only your work and life balance and everything, but also your personal interests. Do you find any correlation between simplification of or really focusing on a specific interest of yours in regards to this idea of having too many communities or too many friendships that you don't actually get the value out of it that you might, or is there a threshold or correlation to this idea that, some of these less developed countries have less things to worry about, not necessarily less things to worry about, and very important things to worry about, but this idea that maybe they're just not overexerting where their interests lie and trying to do too much or have too many communities to really get invested in.
Yeah, and too much choice. And I think that is, we live in this very consumerist world where we have so much choice for everything all the time. And I think that can sometimes be paralyzing, that, if you can be anything, if we're all told, be whatever you want to be, follow your passion, find your path, you can do anything. I think sometimes you kind of think, oh my God, I can't do anything, because it's just, the expectation is so high of what happiness should look like. And, so many choices, so many demands on our time and attention. I think absolutely that it can be quite paralyzing.
Yeah, sorry, just super quick follow-up. Meaning, more specifically, do you think that there's value in trying to find a few interests as opposed to kind of just diversifying that a bit?
Lots of different things. That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't look into that specifically, but and I think that probably depends on the individual as well. I think some people, really have a very deep and abiding passion for one thing, and that really brings them happiness and meaning to follow that. And other people will try lots of different things throughout the course of life. And same with friendships. I think somebody over here asked about, is it one, handful of close friends, or is it knowing lots and lots of people? And I think that is to do with individual personality, really, what it comes down to.
Cool. Any more live questions? If not, we can go to the dory for one or two.
Oh, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. I was actually curious about what you found when you were researching about meditation. because I'm like a natural born cynic generally when it comes to things like this.
Yeah.
But I went to a talk here actually last month. This guy named Daniel Gorman, and it was really interesting and actually kind of skewed me towards. He came with another neuroscience. He came with a neuroscientist, and they basically had done research where meditation and this practice of mindfulness. There was data done where they looked at the brains of monks, and it showed that it actually decreased, stress, and there was just.
And that's actually the same book we were talking about
before.
Altered traits.
Yeah, altered traits.
And so I guess I was curious in your own findings, this is.
So this has been one of the most controversial things actually, that this whole thing around meditation. Every time I ever bring up meditation, I get a million emails from angry meditators all over the world wanting to run me out of town. So I think there's a few things there. I think neuroscience is much more complicated than popular neuroscience would allow us to believe. So when we say something changes the brain, it sounds amazingly impressive, but pretty much everything we do changes the brain. So, from going to the bathroom or to, sitting here now to hearing your questions, everything we do sort of changes the brain because that's the nature of a brain. But so meditation and mindfulness, there have been many thousands of studies done into the effects of these things. And the results have been, I would say, from my experience, that not that there are no effects of these things, but they have been quite strongly overhyped. So there was a meta-analysis that came out a year or two ago, which looked at all of these studies and found that out of something like 1,800 studies, only 40 of them actually had a control comparison group. So I don't know how much people know about how these kind of studies work, but sort of comparing a group of people who meditate to a group of people who don't do anything isn't really a fair comparison because there's so many other factors that could be going on. There could be placebo effect, it could be the effect of having a social connection, whatever. When meditation is compared to a control group where they are doing something comparable, a reasonable control group, meditation performs no better and often worse than something like exercise, listening to spiritual audio tapes, any kind of sham control where you're just putting something to be a controlled condition. So I think we need to approach it with caution, which isn't to say that for many people, it's an extremely meaningful and important part of their day and something that they really get a lot from, and that's great. But I think once we start rolling it out as the answer to everything, then that's where it becomes problematic.
Sorry, one more question.
Sure, yeah.
So while you were writing this book and doing research, was there anything that you found was effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back, just keep banging on about the same thing, but, really it does come down to connecting with other people and doing that in a way that's most, meaningful to you, but, literally spending more time, seeing that we spend half an hour of our day socializing, communicating, as opposed to 3 hours watching television or being on the internet or whatever, and actually just trying to up those minutes, to just spend more time doing it and sort of nurture the relationships that we have. I think that really is far and away the best thing you can do for your own happiness.
Sorry, to clarify,
Sure,
I meant out of all these kind of
these
self-help
things.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting. I think a lot of these self-help things that I did, there were 1 or 2 points within them that were interesting and that I took away and thought about some more. And there were things in the Landmark Forum, there were things from mindfulness that I think in certain situations can be useful, but I think overall any one package of solutions I think is usually over-promising quite heavily, and so there was no one book or app or course or whatever that I could say, okay, well the answer is this, because it didn't really feel that way to me.
Cool. Any more live questions?
Sure, thank you.
Cool. We'll go to one of the Dory questions then. When measuring happiness, how do you correct? Oh yeah, there's a question that's on behind you.
Can't turn around that far.
When measuring happiness, how do you correct for cultural differences in what being somewhat, very, etc. happy? I guess maybe how do you measure for cultural differences when looking at happiness?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of research on this because people in different cultures define happiness in slightly different ways, and I think people in the West tend to favour. There's a word for it which gone from my mind, but very high energy kind of emotions like exhilaration, excitement, you know, real sort of extreme emotions. And I think maybe in some other cultures they value a calmer kind of contentment, whatever. There was some really fascinating research that came out of UC Berkeley recently, which looked at how people defined happiness in different countries around the world, and A, how they defined it, and then B, how happy they were. And they found that in parts of East Asia and in Russia, I think that people defined happiness in a much more collective way. So they didn't really see it as a kind of individual pursuit in the same way that we do in the US, but they saw it more as a kind of socially orientated endeavor. And for those people, the more if you defined happiness in that way, the more you pursued happiness, the happier you became. Whereas in the US, where people define happiness in a more individualistic way, the more you pursue happiness, the less happy you become. So it's kind of the opposite way.
Super fascinating.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, hey, thank you for coming here and thank you for speaking with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It was really
it's been
wonderful.
Such a pleasure. It's been great. Thank you.